The BloodStream Podcast is made possible, as always, by Shire. And for that, we say, thank you, Shire. Hello and welcome to the BloodStream Podcast, episode 23, already laughing at me, April 16th, 2018. I'm Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm Natalie Lynch.
On this episode, Dr. Stephen Pipe joins us to discuss Hemlibra, the recently reported patient deaths, and what this does and does not mean for our community. FDNY Lieutenant, CVS pharmacist, and FEMA volunteer Bill Patsakos joins us to discuss hemophilia and accounting for health conditions during disaster relief, a uniquely interesting topic. And community member and advocate Maryann May shares her hashtag #IBleed2 story. All that and more coming up on this episode. Welcome to BloodStream.
So Patrick, I'm feeling very jealous right now because...
Why is that?
This weekend, you were in Colorado with some of my favorite people.
Oh, that is very true. That is very true.
I was here in LA by my lonesome, but watching on social media the powering through that you did with my cousin Lacey, with our cousin Lacey.
That's right. Because cousin-in-law is just too fussy, so it's just going to be cousin. Or she says Italian by marriage. I think I'm getting a sweatshirt. But yeah, no, we had a great meeting in Colorado. Amy Board and Sean Jeffrey, Jess Bombardier, the staff and volunteers there did an awesome job. We had a Stop the Bleeding workshop with the teens. We had a powering through with Lacey and a couple of the community members, Kathy Bombardier, Chris's mom, and Seth Rajani, who plays wheelchair basketball for Team USA and is just a really neat dude. So it was a great weekend. We had a Bombardier blood panel as well and got to share about the making of. So we were the panelists, which was a cool role reversal. Somebody was asking me the questions, which was like great because I didn't have to prepare anything. Somebody else's responsibility to make sure the thing kept going along.
You just got to show up and be you.
I just got to, they were like, Patrick, would you talk? And I was like, sure, yeah, about anything I want. Okay, yeah, no problem. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. So that was, by the time this episode comes out, that'll have been a little over a week ago. And tomorrow, by the time this episode comes out, is World Hemophilia Day, April 17th. Every year, World Hemophilia Day, a day of international recognition for our community. Cool stuff going on all over the place for World Hemophilia Day. It's kind of a fun time to check out social media. And I know we have some listeners, too, who are not actually members of this community, but they're friends of ours or family members. This is kind of a fun time if you go on social media and look up hashtag hemophilia or world WHD 2018. You can see all the different places that organizations get to light up in red. Like I know LAX, those weird tubular things that I have no idea what they are.
They lit up in red?
They lit up in red. Michelle Kim over here got them to light that up in red.
That's cool.
Yeah, you've seen like cool. I'm doing a terrible job of like selling how many awesome places have lit up in red for hemophilia.
Have we gotten
Hemlibra
Empire
disease.
State Building?
Betty? Yeah, I have a terrible memory. As I don't know if you know.
I bet
that
you
about
Linda
me.
would know.
I bet you Linda Mugford would know. But yeah, so you can check that out on social media. It's kind of a fun time. I want to give one shout out to, a specific shout out to the Hemophilia Foundation of Nigeria. Their founder, Megan Adidaran, who her voice has been on this podcast, not in a long time, but we did a mashup of some of our work with the WFH, the World Federation of Hemophilia, that featured Megan probably like a year and a half ago, but she's just an extraordinary human being, and she is the founder and executive director of the Hemophilia Foundation of Nigeria. They just launched a website, mylifeourstory.blog, and it documents the stories of people living with hemophilia in Nigeria. And it's brand new, but it's already well populated. I'm looking at it now. They've got their various social channels connected to this page, their Instagram, Facebook, Twitter accounts, photo gallery, blog page, contact information about how to donate. So for World Hemophilia Day, if you're looking for a specific part of the world, I guess, to dip your toe into and learn a little more, I would recommend you check out mylifeourstory.blog. There'll be a link, of course, in the program notes. Also want to make mention, speaking of international stuff, the video that Believe Limited produced and I directed for the WFH's humanitarian aid program about factor and corrective surgeries in India, short film, a little under 7 minutes long, is now up. It is live on YouTube and on Facebook. There'll be a link in the program notes as well. It's called Factor and Corrective Surgeries in India. You were a part of that trip where we shot that video.
I was. That was a
you
fun
made some
trip.
friends.
Hi, if they're listening.
So yeah, that'll be available. That's available now as well. Link in the program notes. And then a few BloodStream media updates. Dr. Maryann May Johnson, the accomplished director of the HTC in Denver, Colorado, is the latest guest on the Ask the Expert podcast with Chris Bombardier, talking all about gene therapy. So we got Dr. Pipe on the comment segment today, talking about Hemlibra and the recent patient deaths and this non-factory placement therapy and how we're continuing to wrap our heads around that. We got Dr. May Johnson with Chris Bombardier on the Ask the Expert podcast, talking about gene therapy. We got all the fancy doctors talking about all the relevant topics. What don't we have here at BloodStream Media? Come at me. You don't have to come at me. That was a little much. I don't know where that came from. I just got really excited. The latest episode of the Powering Through podcast features community members Devin Kress and Kelly Kimmel, as well as filmmaker and activist Naomi McDougall-Jones, who's a really interesting artist and human being. You can check that out as well. And reminder that all of our podcasts are available for free online and can be found at bloodstreammedia.com. So we're playing around a little bit with the structure of this month's episode. We have Bill Patsakos is our sit-down segment interview guest coming up a little bit later. The comment segment for this month, we've bumped that up to right now. You're here. This is part of it right now, this intro. And it's actually going to be the conversation that I had with Dr. Pipe around Hemlibra. So just a little background before we get into the interview pretty quickly here. There have been 5 patient deaths reported by patients who were taking Hemlibra. There were some press releases from Genentech, who produces Hemlibra, a member of the Roche organization, that identified none of these cases of patient deaths where Hemlibra played no role. But for various accountability reasons, the patient deaths do need to be reported when they occur, either on clinical trials or in compassionate use scenarios, which are the case with these 5 individuals. So Dr. Pipe, he is the chair of NHF's Medical and Scientific Advisory Council. He is a leading hematologist and authority in our community, and he was generous enough to spend some time with me after his working hours just a couple days ago to talk through what these patient deaths mean, what they don't mean, what the important details that kind of get lost with the striking headline, patient death. And I frankly learned a good amount just chatting with him and hearing him talk through the process. Personally, I feel a little more comforted after talking with Dr. Pipe and getting a little more information from folks at Genentech as well. And that information is going to be part of what you're going to hear too. So listen to what he has to say. Be curious. Ask questions of your hematologist and leaders at your patient organization. But I hope you find some, I actually would be surprised if you don't find some really valuable and new takeaways from this conversation with Dr. Pipe. So here it is, my conversation with Dr. Pipe about Hemlibra. Okay, joining me now on the line, he is a pediatric hematologist from Michigan, probably best known to the community for his role as the chair of the National Hemophilia Foundation's Medical and Scientific Advisory Council, also known as MASAC, Dr. Stephen Pipe. Good afternoon, Dr. Pipe. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good afternoon.
So, as I mentioned, people are probably familiar with you from your work with MASAC, perhaps your work in Michigan as a practicing physician. Just curious to know what relationship you've had, if any, to Genentech, to these clinical trials. How involved have you been with the development of Hemlibra over the last few years?
So I was not an investigator on any of the registration trials. I did have one patient who was on the later trials. I am an active investigator in their post-approval phase here. I'm an investigator for one of the non-inhibitor arms of the trials, Haven 4. I can speak to the Haven 1 and 2 trials with respect to all the reported data and the published data, et cetera.
I see. Okay. And what is a clinical trial investigator? That's a term that has been kind of more frequently in news releases over the last few months or few years as more and more products are in trials. What does a clinical trial investigator do?
As an investigator, you have very strict obligations, not from the company specifically, but from the regulators who have oversight over all clinical trials. So in the U.S., that's the FDA, and then also you have you have a responsibility to your institution. And so all of our institutions have institutional review boards. They review the study. They make sure that it looks like it's a scientifically valid study and that it has good foundation on all the preclinical studies, etc. And they charge the principal investigator at the site to be ultimately responsible for everything that happens with that study. And of course, safety and efficacy is the primary endpoints for these studies. And so we have very strict guidelines for how we evaluate adverse events that occur in the course of a trial and how we report them. And depending on the severity, often those get reported directly to the company and the regulators in a very short period of time.
And then when they are reported, and when the adverse events or the serious adverse events are as when there are patient deaths, which I suppose is always the kind of worst case scenario, what does that trigger once that is reported? What happens next?
By the time a study actually gets published, all of that data has been reviewed from all the investigative sites. And then even more so, the FDA has they have the full comprehensive data set from everything that happened in the trial. Everything from a runny nose to a skin rash to a patient who falls and breaks their arm. All of that's part of the study materials, and they review everything before they make their determination about whether the drug met the endpoints that are important for registration. So I think what I would want all the listeners to understand is how much safety data is collected and reviewed at many, many levels before a drug ever has a chance of actually being approved and come to the marketplace.
And of course, we're under the umbrella right now of clinical trials. And we did mention earlier that some of these patients these 5 patients who have passed away, some of them were on compassionate use of Hemlibra. So let's just pivot, and before we kind of get into what this recent story means for the community and what it doesn't mean, let's define what compassionate use means. What is compassionate use, and how is the monitoring and the reporting on patients who are using a treatment through compassionate use, how is that akin and different from the way those in clinical trials are monitored and reported on?
It is very different. So, when you're on a clinical trial, that's a voluntary participation by a patient. They agree to abide by all the requirements of the study, so coming for their study visits, keeping a diary of all their symptoms at home, dosing in a precise way, etc. And they agree with the principal investigator to report everything to the study oversight teams, and they know that ultimately that will be reviewed by the regulators. But it's a process by which a clinician like myself could contact a company that has an active clinical trial program, and I could say, here's the situation. I've got Jimmy. He's in a real bind. He doesn't meet eligibility for any of your criteria, or maybe the study's closed now and he would have met the criteria, but we just couldn't get him on at the time, and he's having all kinds of troubles for whatever reason. Is it possible that we could try to make his life better by giving him access to your drug outside the clinical trial? These are not perfectly well people walking around who just decided one day, I would like to get access to that study drug. These are people that had serious medical problems and sometimes even a life-threatening condition. It's up to the clinician to review what happened in the patient and say, did this patient just die because of their underlying, condition, or in any way did the study drug, was it responsible for that? There's no evidence that this was in any way attributable to the patients taking the drug, and I don't think any of them speak to the efficacy of the drug in controlling bleeding, because these are not the scenarios that the drug was tested on in clinical trials.
So kind of just looking at this from a slightly different angle, I want to read for you a little bit of an email that I got from a parent who has 2 sons, one with severe A, no inhibitors, one with severe A with an inhibitor. And we were talking about Hemlibra. And I just want to read what's here because it kind of speaks to the same thing we were just discussing about hemorrhages and bleeding events when you have an inhibitor, but from a slightly different angle. So I'll read this and then get your take on it. When gene therapy comes to market, a severe hemophiliac like my older son can get it and basically become a mild hemophiliac that doesn't infuse. It's not theoretically cured, but it functions that way. That's enough to stop prophy and only treat as needed. Unfortunately, for an inhibitor patient like my younger son, gene therapy may be worthless because fixing the body's ability to produce more factor is fruitless if his immune system attacks and destroys it anyway. Now, if we put my younger son on Hemlibra, the potential benefits are reduced sticks and reduced ABR, annual bleed rate. Both sound great. However, in the event of a head bleed or one near any other vital organ, when it is necessary to treat quickly and to stop bleeding, the idea of factor being destroyed by an immune system that no longer recognizes it is rather scary. For a patient like my younger son that plays sports and is very active, that's pretty scary. While many inhibitor patients have significantly reduced their ABR, most were not very active, perhaps due to their inhibitor. So there is little to no data, and certainly not enough, regarding such situations to give physicians any idea of the boundaries, how far that they can push limits before patients have thrombotic events. We don't want to be the pioneers to discover those limits, as the risk is death and the rewards simply aren't enough for us to justify it, and our younger son is doing well enough right now. And I know this younger son is someone whose inhibitor has been problematic for periods of his life, but in the recent past, they've gotten it stabilized enough so that he is playing sports and able to engage in more activities than he was able to just a handful of years ago. So this is a patient with an inhibitor who's relatively controlled, and you can hear the concern coming through because this patient is not like our compassionate use hypothetical patients here, or actual patients that we're just not speaking about specifically, where their quality of life is so desperate that they're just looking for any opportunity to try to improve their lot in life. But what's your response to a patient or a family that's in the shoes of this parent? Because that's an interesting kind of way to think about Hemlibra as well.
The issue is what is the current state of that patient? How are they managed? How well are they managed on their current, regimen? And does Hemlibra offer any potential advantages for them? And then we would review what the patient is on currently, and are we satisfied with their degree of bleed control or the lifestyle that they're being allowed to live? The other data that we have that I think is important for this clinical trial program is there were lots of patients, just like I described, or like this family has described, who were the exact patients who were enrolled in the clinical trial programs. But another good portion of patients came in already on prophylaxis. We knew what their bleed rates were on prophylaxis and with bypassing agents, and then they were transitioned to Hemlibra, and we were able to compare the before and after of how they did. I would want my patients to hear all of that, and including, the family you're talking about. Yes, they may have very good control right now with what they're on. This affords an opportunity to also look at the burden of what it's taken for them to get the control they have right now, and are there some additional advantage that might be offered by Hemlibra. We've known for years that the biggest risk of having an inhibitor is that you're going to have a bleeding event that you can't control. We know that, the harsh facts of having an inhibitor are you're twice as likely to be hospitalized for bleeding than you are with someone who doesn't have an inhibitor. Inhibitors are going to increase your risk for repeated bleeding into your joints and lead to joint damage. And death due to a bleeding-related cause is significantly higher when you have an inhibitor than without.
So my big takeaway from this conversation and thinking more about these recent headlines and Hemlibra in general is that really what we're talking about, it kind of comes back to inhibitors are just terrible. That at the end of the day, it's inhibitors are what's the problem. And when you have patients who are on compassionate use of a product, that right there tells you this is a patient who's in a desperate situation. The FDA obviously recognized how important how important the treatment developments for patients with inhibitors is, and which is why this was fast-tracked through the FDA, through the clinical trial process. And now we're starting to see that it's out and available, and according to Genentech, there's been over 600 people with hemophilia A who have been treated with Hemlibra. And we're now starting to see, like, oh, yeah, inhibitors are still terrible. And this does not eradicate the inhibitor, and therefore it's still going to find a way to poke its head through and remind you of how devastating it is, and to the statistics that you gave us, those harsh realities. Those are just being brought to the forefront now that we're contending with a new treatment product. However, we shouldn't let that be reason to dismiss the product itself or negatively shine a light on what this therapy can offer most patients who are taking it.
But the question then is, if a patient does have an adverse event, how would we know whether it was just because they had an inhibitor, or it was due to something that was unexpected now that it's in the post authorization phase? So after a drug's been approved, they don't just give them, a free rein and say, well, whatever happens from here on in. They have very strict reporting. Now, as a community, I believe we also have an obligation collectively to keep track of new drugs when they come into the marketplace. Roche was trying to be very open in communicating with the community about reports related to the use of their drug. I think this is a timely discussion today to help our listeners understand about the depths and the continued vigilance that occurs and should occur in our community when we have new drugs come onto the treatment landscape like this.
You mentioned it's been a long time since we've had a new class of products. We've seel the extended half-life, the EHL products come out, but it's been a while since the early 90s that we've had recombinant, which was the last leapfrog moment. My stance is, and I think there's a number of people who are in my category, so I'm curious to hear your response to this, is that I'm doing very well. I'm not somebody like one of the patients who might be using Hemlibra with compassionate use header because things are really going poorly for me. I'm doing great. Now, the idea of sticking myself less, giving my veins a break, I like the sound of all of that. And yet I see I worry because what I'm doing now, while it involves more sticks and more product and a little more fridge space, it's doing really well for me. So for someone like me who just who hears the gray area around treatment of bleeds with Hemlibra, who hears about deaths, and despite everything we just spoke about and all the logic behind why it's not something that should necessarily dissuade an individual from considering Hemlibra if it's of interest to them, just as the human being in me just kind of goes, just keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. What would you say to people in my position?
If I'm satisfied that their bleed control is good and their joints are healthy and they're living their life the way they want to, then that's terrific. There's going to be some who are really sick and tired of what prophy means, and they hear about a
sure.
They hear about a subcutaneous dosing, and maybe the younger kids can get rid of their central venous lines. And it's once a week instead of every other day. And I'm sure there's going to be families and patients who are going to be clamoring for that kind of a transition. But I'm almost certain there's going to be that other group who are going to say, you know what, I've been on Factor VIII my whole life. I know what it does. I know I can deal with every clinical scenario that would I be faced with. I could break my leg tomorrow. I could need surgery tomorrow. I could be in a car accident, and I would know that Factor VIII would deal with all of those scenarios, and I'm just not willing to switch. And I would say, great. We now have so many more choices than we had just a few years ago. But I would also say, even in the context of inhibitors, I think Hemlibra is a significant innovation that is going to have a major impact on the outcomes for patients going forward.
Thinking back to when you were first made aware of Hemlibra, emicizumab, ACE910, and whatever other name that's had along the way, when you first heard about it, what were the hopes that you had for this investigational product? And then through the trial, through the adverse events that we've heard about to today, how have those hopes changed, if at all? As you just said, it's an incredible product for at least some patients with inhibitors. But I'm just curious to kind of hear the trajectory from your point of view of when you first heard about it through these developments, how the hopes for this has changed.
this achieves essentially a steady state in the blood. So what has also been eliminated with this drug are the concept of peaks and troughs. That's a different level of protection than going from a peak that's maybe in the normal level and then having a trough that's very close to being back down to the severe level. And so my hopes then again for this drug is that steady state hemostatic correction actually could have advantages over the long run. One encouraging thing I saw from the clinical trial program is that patients in the latter half of the trial follow-up were doing even better than they were doing in the early half. So what I'm trying to say there is it implied that their joints were actually getting better over time. So it wasn't just a matter of bleed control, but their bleed control was good enough that it was giving a chance for even some of their joints to heal so that they were even less likely to bleed later. I want to see what that data looks like over 5 and 10 years or longer.
Absolutely, because you also figure if people are stabilizing to a point where they're able to be more physically active, they're also then maybe proactively stretching and strengthening to levels that they haven't before because they're enabled to do so and they're empowered to do so. But as you said, we'll only really kind of see that as more time goes by. Dr. Pipe, you've been very generous with your time. Is there anything that we didn't touch on as it relates to Hemlibra or this recent story that you feel like we'd be remiss to not add? We've covered a lot of ground, but is there anything left as far as you're concerned?
I think what you want to make abundantly clear for people may remember that there were adverse events as part of the clinical trial program, but this recent report of deaths actually has nothing to do with thrombosis whatsoever. These are patients who were had bleeding or from other reasons, but I want people to hopefully have not made the incorrect connection that, well, these recent reports are a resurgence of the observations that came from the clinical trial, because that's absolutely not true.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time today, and I'm sure there'll be something that motivates us to do one of these again sooner than not. So until then, take care, and thank you, Dr. Pipe.
Oh, you're welcome. We'll talk to you soon.
I also wanted to share, just before we close out this comment segment here, some information that was provided to me by Elizabeth Walmsley at Genentech. We are committed to providing timely and transparent updates on the safety profile of Hemlibra to health authorities, who are going to be adults, but specific ones, health authorities, healthcare professionals, and the hemophilia community. For medical inquiries about Hemlibra, patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals can call our medical communications phone number at 1-800-821-8590 between 5 a.m. and 5 Pacific, Monday through Friday. Again, that is 800-821-8590 between 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. Pacific, Monday through Friday. We are also working on a Hemlibra safety website that we will update on an ongoing basis, so just thought I should provide you with that phone number and that update as well. Thank you once again to Dr. Pipe for taking some time to talk through Hemlibra, this recent news, and what it does and does not mean for our community. All right, now moving on to this month's Like segment, we turn it over to Natalie, who's going to present a piece on floating. Natalie, what is floating?
What is floating? So floating is a sensory deprivation tank that is filled with magnesium, which essentially Epsom salts. So a highly concentrated Epsom salt bath.
Okay.
They have 10 inches of water in these pods and kind of a little shield that you can pull down over. So there's no light, no sound, and your body completely floats in said pod.
Okay. All right. And you do this for, how long do you do this for?
So 60 to 90 minutes is a typical float session. And yeah, it's amazing. It's both sensory deprivation and also just like being in Epsom salts. You know, if you're an athlete or someone who has sore muscles or joints, an Epsom salt bath is amazing. So this is like that on steroids. Okay. Alongside sensory deprivation, so you can completely shut your mind down and really just reap the benefits of soaking in this salt water. So a bunch of these float places have popped up recently, but this is not a new thing. It was developed in the 50s and got more popular around 1970s. Dr. John Lilly was a neuroscientist who worked for the National Institute of Health and specialized in cognition and brain activity. He helped pioneer this technology.
And what are the benefits of floating? What does it do for the body?
So there have, both anecdotally and scientifically, there have been small scale studies that have studied floating. Stress reduction, anxiety relief, sports recovery, pain relief, overall promoting relaxation, reducing headaches, increasing circulation, leading to more restful sleep, allowing you to learn to meditate, and just 60 to 90 minutes of not being bothered by anyone. Yeah,
that sounds pretty good too.
Yeah, just complete shutdown time. So able to, process. But yeah, so some of the small scale studies back to the idea that floating and sensory deprivation, that's the combination,
soding, yeah, very common word.
Increased activity in the visual cortexes and also increased creativity. Also, a more detailed study in the 80s found a reduction of levels of stress hormones and blood pressure after floating. So, okay. All pretty cool benefits of just taking an hour to soak in some Epsom salts.
And let your body recover.
Yeah.
So it's not terribly surprising that this is something that during a resurgence period might be common and popular in Los Angeles, where we live. Do you have any idea of how common it is around the U.S. in general and where people can go to find out where they can float?
Well, in our program notes is linked to the blog. And in the blog, there is a link to flotation locations.
You know what? We're so generous. We'll put both links in the program notes. I'm not going to make people click a link to get to a link. That sounds horrible. If I was listening to this and they were like, if you click the link and then click, as it is, they have to go to bloodstreammedia.com to click through for the other podcasts. But that's all we'll ask you to do. But anyway, both of those links will in fact be in the program notes.
Yeah. So Patrick and I actually tested it out.
We did.
We went a couple weeks ago.
It's like a reveal. We played it off real well for 3 minutes. Reveal. We've done this.
How was your experience?
I enjoyed it. I didn't have the experience that you did, which was a much more, I feel like, experience aligned with the intention. It was very meditative for you and transformative in some ways. I kind of just had fun being in a tank of water and enjoyed that. But I have to say that I did sleep that night extremely well because I'm a loyal Fitbit wearer, and I'm kind of obsessive about my steps and my calories burned and my sleep habits. And I slept really, I forget offhand.
25% of your night was deep sleep.
And I averaged 15%. So 25 up from 15 is super huge. And deep sleep is where you do a lot of that healing, right? That's where your body does a lot of recovery work. So that aspect of it alone, I can't deny based on what my Fitbit science tells me.
Especially your physical body. So that's interesting to me too, because I bet if we went back through all your Fitbit metrics, I don't know if we could find a 25% night.
Man, it sounds like a fun little bit of homework on our hands.
But yeah, so, floating definitely, and for me, it was an incredibly meditative experience. And I came out it was like a metaphysical experience for me.
Yeah.
And my body was relaxed the whole day. And I think I slept well too. I'm not as on it with my Fitbit metrics, but
that's not quite your thing.
But yeah, so links are in the program notes to both flotation locations and to the blog article, which also has the small scale studies that have been done by universities embedded in the blog article as well, if you're really interested in diving deep into floating.
Right on. All right. Well, thanks for presenting that for us. All right, our next segment on this kind of remixed version of the BloodStream Podcast, segment-wise. It's always funny to me, podcasts I listen to, when they talk about moving a segment or changing a bit of the infrastructure of the podcast. As a listener, you never really care. You're like, all right, I guess you have to say this for your own process. But you don't care. But here I am doing it.
Or also probably pay attention. I don't know. I'd be like, oh, maybe I just missed that other part. Yeah. Maybe I spaced out.
I don't. Well, you're talking to the beat reporter today before doing the recap of last night's whatever.
But tell them.
This month's share segment comes to us from New Hampshire, from advocate and activist Maryann May, a piece that she has titled #IBleed2. We'll turn it over now to Maryann to take you through it.
#IBleed2. 4 years ago, I found out the hard way that none of us are just carriers. That was when I had a pretty significant brain bleed. Here's what happened. I had been riding my bike one day. I was training for the New England Gears for Good ride. When I got done, my son picked me up and I realized I couldn't talk. I knew what I wanted to say, but the words were jumbled and slurred, and I kept stuttering. I attributed it to being tired. There was no pain, there was no headache, and being a lifelong migraine sufferer, I might have been more alert if there were. This was on a Saturday. My son was concerned, but I'm still mom, so I overruled his concerns. The following day, I met some friends in a town about 30 miles from home to ride a rail trail. We rode 24 miles that day, and I think I mentioned that talking was hard, but I also was quiet and took a long time speaking, so it wasn't apparent. Going home from there, a place where I had been numerous times, I needed my GPS. Still, no pain, no red flags. The next day was Memorial Day. I worked at our local hospital as a phlebotomist, so my son suggested that I stop in at the ER on my way to work and just see what they thought. I punched in, I got my lab coat on, and I walked over to the ER to talk with the doctor. In the process of explaining what was happening, by now I couldn't find certain keys on the keyboard, and I had trouble using the keypad to enter the ER door. I see him watching and listening to me. Instead of him saying that, yeah, I probably was overtired, he said, "Why don't you go take your lab coat off? We're going to do a CAT scan." Within 20 minutes, I was in an ambulance on my way to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. I had a bleed in my brain, resulting in a hole about the size of a quarter. 3 days in neurology ICU, an MRI of my head, visits from the hemophilia team, and a plethora of doctors and residents. The diagnosis was acute intraparenchymal hemorrhage, which means brain bleed. The cause? After an angiogram and multiple other tests that only found everything normal, the diagnosis was that in all probability, after years of overuse of Excedrin for migraine headaches, the combination of my own low factor levels and the salicylates, which is aspirin, in Excedrin, it caused a spontaneous brain bleed. It took several weeks to be able to speak and think clearly, but it only took moments for me to realize how dangerous it is for any of us that are just carriers to ignore our own diagnosis. I was a mom. I wasn't a bleeder. I took care of other people. I wasn't to be cared for. How quickly that all changed. Now, we're all more aware and more likely to speak up than we were 4 years ago, and we're also more likely to be heard.
I am grateful for my son and his ability to care for me. It shows me that we have raised him well, because it is the whole bleeding disorder community that did this. We've raised a generation of caring, intuitive people. As I was writing this, I went back over the reports to make sure I had the facts right. I was reading the notes from my first follow-up visit after the incident. The last paragraph of the report is still true. It also made me smile. There are no other neurological deficits. She has good strength, no numbness or tingling. It is mainly her speech that was affected, and she is a bit frustrated by the whole situation. But she also tells me she is not going to live her life worrying about whether this is going to happen spontaneously again or not.
Community news.
That's it. That's right. You got it. Community news is what is next. Our next segment on the remix version of the BloodStream Podcast, April 16, 2018. Why do you have community news stresses you out?
It gives me so much anxiety.
You even put this one together. You know what it says.
I know, but it's just reading it quickly and
Oh my goodness.
But I'm excited. I'm excitable but stressed.
Yeah. No, that's all pretty clear. Okay.
In my face.
Yeah. All right. So.
Oh God, the timer.
Here we are. We got the timer. We're going to put 60 seconds on the clock. You know the deal. It's community news in 60 seconds. And our time, and Natalie, starts now.
The Ambrosio family of New York City Hemophilia chapter celebrated their 10th annual benefit fundraiser, raising over $35,000 for the chapter.
CSL Plasma introduced Miguel Angel Jimenez to children with hemophilia during a PGA Champions Tour event in Boca Raton, during which the golf legend provided putting lessons.
Scientists in Australia have identified a gene control mechanism that enables some individuals to reduce fetal form of hemoglobin, offsetting the severity of certain blood diseases.
That was perfect. Precision develops better way of detecting levels of clotting factor inhibitors. Precision has said that the kit has the potential to standardize the detection of factor VIII inhibitor levels.
BioMarin wins an award for getting gene therapy facility operation ahead of time. The award was for project execution. BioMarin took only a year from the time the project began.
Hey, how about that? Many hemophilia B patients have pain, depression, and overall poor health, a study finds. The B Hero S trial focused on patients with hemophilia B and included men, women, and caregivers of children with the disease, a previously underrepresented population in studies of this nature.
New method may improve delivery of targeted gene therapies. Study reports.
2, 1.
A delivery method of using nanotube.
It's all over. That's it.
Oh, we did okay, though. We almost got through the last one.
I mean, yeah, we did okay. We did okay. We're not going to do it again, but we did okay. So if you want to read more about any of that stuff, didn't understand a word, and are curious, or you're just really bored, go to the program notes and you can find the links there. Just want to take another quick moment to recognize Shire for making the BloodStream Podcast possible. Shire has been the supporter of this podcast since we started all the way back in 2016 and all the way up through this. Thank you. You like that voice? Oh, I got a reaction.
He loves reactions.
Yeah. So once a performer, always a performer. You can't help yourself.
All right, but back on track. Thank you, Shire.
Thank you, Shire. Yeah, thanks a lot for supporting this podcast. All right, we get now to our interview with Bill Patsakos. So I had put out a word to put out a word. What does that even mean? I put out a word.
That's a thing.
I put the word out, is what you say, right?
I put out a word.
You don't say that. Do people say that?
Isn't that like a call to action? Like, I put out a word.
Maybe.
Or I'll put out a word. That's what people say. Like, in response to like someone saying something, it's like, oh, I'll put out a word to like my networks.
I'll put in a good word for you, put the word out. I don't think, I think this other thing is made up.
I'm just trying to help you.
I appreciate that. And I'm like wanting to support you trying to support me, but I think we're wrong.
Okay.
So I'll just try again. I put the word out. Wow. By the way, you should also watch the Stop the Bleeding bloopers. I just made Natalie watch some of them recently, and I'm just reminding myself of that Seth and Drew moment from season 1 with would you like a cannoli perhaps? And the inability to get through that. So watch Stop the Bleeding bloopers. We'll put a link in the program notes so you can check them out. All right, so the interview segment, that's what we're here to talk about. Bill Patsakos is a very fascinating Renaissance man. So he is a father of 4. 3 are boys with hemophilia B. I believe all 3 are severe hemophilia B. He is an FDNY lieutenant. He has a military background. He is a pharmacist for CVS, and he works with FEMA on disaster relief. So when they deploy teams out to these areas that are struck by natural disasters, when you hear FEMA's going somewhere, Bill's one of those people that's leading teams in these places. So I had put the word out in the spirit of World Hemophilia Today. I wanted to get a little bit of a pulse check on how community is doing in the greater Houston area, throughout parts of Florida, in the Caribbean, and Puerto Rico, and in these areas where over the last year or so we've heard of these devastating disasters. And I just kind of thought it'd be nice to just remind ourselves, like, people with bleeding disorders who need medicine, who need hospitals, who need infrastructure, they are affected by these. I mean, everyone's obviously affected by who lives there, but our community is as well. So Bill was kind of a perfect person to talk to about how do you account for community during these times when there are so many needs in disaster relief, and he was able to speak to it in a very direct and personal way. I thought it was a great conversation. He is uniquely equipped to discuss this topic, and I hope you enjoy what he has to say. So here it is, Bill Patsakos on disaster relief and bleeding disorders care. All right, with me on the line here is Mr. Bill Patsakos. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for making the time today. You have numerous titles that keep you busy. Firefighter, you are a pharmacist, a Army veteran from Medical Service Corps, and you're a father of you have three boys?
First son, yeah, he's 19 and he didn't have hemophilia, he doesn't have it, and then we went 3 for 3 after that.
Well, fair enough. So, Bill, as we were just kind of chatting about off mic, the reason that we wanted to talk to you today was because with World Hemophilia Day being the day after this podcast airs, April 17th, as it is every year, different organizations and companies and individuals are raising awareness about hemophilia and doing different things to bring more attention to hemophilia and bleeding disorders at large. But I thought it'd be nice for us on BloodStream to kind of focus on the areas of the U.S. that have been particularly devastated this past year. And I'm talking specifically about Texas, Florida, and most prominently Puerto Rico. And you actually have some boots on the ground understanding of what's gone on in each of these areas, both generally and then how as it relates to hemophilia as well. So before we get too specific, could you just give our listeners an overview of what exactly it is that you do that brings you to these different areas?
I work as a medical unit leader for the FDNY Incident Management Team. We're a Type 3 incident management team, and basically what that means is we handle all hazards, and whenever there's a natural disaster that strikes in the United States or pretty much anywhere in the world, we can be sent, usually the hiring agency is FEMA, and the point of contact, or it requires the governor of that state, or if it's a foreign country, that the president of that country to ask for assistance, declare that declaration of emergency, and then have our government agree to send supplies and manpower and resources to those areas. One that we constantly get every year that we tend to forget is wildfires out on the West Coast. And when we have those wildfires, we have members of our hemophilia community that their immediate care is disrupted. And then so when we look at the way that the United States was dealt a couple of blows this year, we had 2 significant hurricanes and several massive wildfires and mudslides on the West Coast simultaneously. So it kind of taxed the resources of these incident management teams, of which we're on the New York Incident Management Team.
Gotcha. And when you specifically are, I don't know if that's the right word, but say deployed as part of an incident management team, what's your role?
So my particular role as a medical unit leader is to gather medical resources. And when we say resources, we're not just talking about medicine, we're also talking about people. The federal government categorizes resources. The single resource would be a doctor, a PA, a nurse, EMTs, paramedics, and other healthcare providers, and then facilities where we would be able to set up and treat our first responders, the people within the area, and how we could assist our local hospitals and local emergency services within the area that the incident takes place. So there's a lot of work that goes into it beforehand, then once you get there, and then as the incident scales down and things are able to as you bring each, let's say sector or town up and running, you're going to, pack up, move, and change your approach as the incident grows. And then ultimately it lies with the agency administrator of that town, which could be the mayor, the governor, or the president of the United States, which will dictate to us what we're going to continue to do.
So when you are deployed to an area and doing this work, obviously you can't just say, all right, everybody, I got some hemophilia related business that I'm going to go do. Good luck with everything else. Like, how do you wind up working in your hemophilia advocate hat within the broader responsibilities that you have? And I imagine these responsibilities are kind of shifting all the time because you're working in disaster relief. It's not as though the plan is always going to unfold as predicted. So how do you wear that advocate hat at the same time?
Before I knew I was going, I was able to reach out to Kim Phelan and the coalition and ask them to collect as many supplies as possible. And then we worked with the governor's office to set up a location in Brooklyn where we were warehousing this and utilizing government assets to ship the stuff down there. While I was preparing for my regular role, what I would do is I would, be on the phone and make my email contacts with people in either Florida, Texas, or Puerto Rico, take the material down, be able to have it warehoused. Then on my time off, many times I'm able to utilize my vehicle to take what would be my downtime to go and visit the hemophilia chapter, the HTC, and the staff and deliver stuff and to see what they need. So a lot of times, if I can do it in the course of my business, the government business, then I would do that because I'm going to those facilities anyway. Being a pharmacist for CVS also helped tremendously because they have they have their tentacles everywhere. They have large warehousing capabilities. They had a private charter jet. They were able to fly hemophilia and oncology supplies down. Really what it just was like, being able to take all these resources together, and then in the course of me moving around throughout the disaster area, find out the point of contact and try to find out what they need and get them the supplies. You're never going to get any pushback from those agency administrators, because they're, first of all, a lot of times unaware of this need because we're such a small subset of the population. So when you take those and you take some severe, very rare cancer patients and you're able to go out and meet their needs, that becomes part of the mission. And it gets written into the incident action plan.
And do you think because you have 3 boys with hemophilia and you're active within this community, do you think that's influenced your awareness of looking out for people with chronic, serious, rare diseases or illnesses when you are responding to situations over the years, hemophilia and beyond?
Absolutely, because the thing is, I put myself in a parenting role, like how helpless I would feel if I was unable to treat, my son's having a bleed, if I was unable to get them to a hospital, if it could be lethal, and if not lethal, it could have real serious effects, moving forward beyond the incident. You have to think about the whole patient. So when I think about myself, if I lost my job or lost my insurance or lost my home, and then on top of that, I had no way of getting medical care for my children, it would be devastating.
Absolutely. And I think you'd be looking out for people who are like you, who are also wearing that parenting hat and maybe in a position to do something. I think that's who you'd be looking out for. If you were in their shoes, you'd be looking for yourself. So it was kind of interesting that we had these major natural disasters in different parts of the country, and to see the response from the government and from just the country in general. How would you I don't want to weigh them against each other or pit them against each other. Obviously, a devastating event for a person, a family, a community, a city is devastating, and it doesn't really do too much good to compare it to others in the long run. But from an outsider's perspective, it would be interesting to me, what did you see on the ground that was different in one area than the next? And was there anything that struck you as unusual or surprising?
So I think that each area geographically is different. When you're dealing with California, they're very used to their wildfire season, and they're well prepared for it. They're also a large state, vertically, so it allows different opportunities to bring aid in and to bring other resources in, and so there's a big difference. Texas was very similar, and Texas was well prepared, and there was multiple ways for different agencies, non-for-profit, Red Cross, private citizens, as well as city, state, and federal government resources to get into those areas. I think it was important when the federal government was able to affect shipping and the Jones Act. I think that you're able to come up into the Gulf of Mexico. So geography plays a big role. So, for example, when we were able to set up a base camp, when we talk about Florida was widespread damage on both coasts. But the damage was where it was most significant was in the Keys, which again becomes an area like Puerto Rico. It's isolated, and you can't just get to it unless you're going to use shipping, and so that presented its own challenge. However, for the hemophilia community, we didn't have many patients in the south of Homestead area. When we look up in northern Florida, we were able to bring in the National Guard. And the area came under control from Jacksonville all the way down very quickly. Now, when you talk about Puerto Rico, the issues that Puerto Rico had was it was facing an existing infrastructure deficit, tremendous. That both their water and electric infrastructure were already tremendously taxed and were not operating efficiently for the previous few years prior to the hurricane. Second, they're in economic depression. A significant economic depression. They're unable to work out situations with the government where they're able to restructure their debt. So many of their civil services are unpaid, underfunded, understaffed, and under-equipped. One of the biggest problems Puerto Rico had was being able to, there was no phones and no power. So you couldn't reach the people who lived on the island that would normally be driving the trucks. That was the biggest problem, was disseminating out the aid. Everything came centrally into San Juan, and communications and transportation was at a standstill. And it took weeks to get that up. And when you couple that with a lack of power and water, the people were solely focusing on survival. They weren't able to go to work. They weren't able to communicate. They had cell phone service. They would have to drive onto the highway and pull over on the side of a highway to try to find cell service to be able to call up. The HTC staffing itself had issues because the main hematologist that treats hemophilia was out on maternity leave. There was product available, but getting it to the patients, getting aid to the patients, food, water, supplies, it was a logistical nightmare. And it took months, not weeks, to be able to get this thing running back again.
And as best you know, with regard to the HTC and the treatment of people with hemophilia in Puerto Rico, where do we stand today?
We have HTC is keeping track of the patients that have left, and they've been put in contact with local chapters, national NHF and HFA, and local treatment centers wherever they're put. And it's a continuing process for the families that have stayed there to get their homes taken care of. So we're trying to assist them in directing them with FEMA on taking care of all of their needs besides hemophilia. Because once we were able to get them medication and we're able to find out who can infuse and who can't, that problem was pretty much resolved. However, if you're worried about your home and your job and your groceries, you can only imagine that medication compliance would take the back seat. And office visit compliance with doctors is going to take a hit because you're worried about all the other areas of your life.
And Bill, what about in Houston or Florida or any other places that maybe didn't make national headlines but that have experienced significant disasters in the last year or two? Is there anything notable about where those places may be today?
Sure. I mean, I think the earthquake in Mexico was significant. It occurred around the same time, and it was beginning to get aid, and then it fell by the wayside. Also, the other Caribbean islands. You have the U.S. Virgin Islands. You have the French side and the English side. A lot of those islands, St. Thomas, St. Martin, that were completely devastated as well. And they have hemophiliac patients in those areas and other patients with chronic conditions. So I think that, with Mexico and with the Caribbean right now, and I think that the wildfire season in California will ramp up again. If we don't continue to grow our plan and get more people involved, it can be a real problem.
So on that note about getting more people involved, I think a lot of people are probably feeling similar to me when they hear about earthquake in Mexico, devastating hurricane, Category 4 ripping through the Caribbean, where it sounds horrible and you feel terrible, but you also kind of feel a little helpless. Like what can I do? And I suppose you can donate money, and not to be reductive about that, because I know that sometimes you simply need to give more funds to organizations and infrastructures that are able to carry out the tasks that need to occur. But I imagine you get this question often enough, so I'll ask it to you. When I hear about something like this, what could I do that would make a meaningful difference?
So we should never underestimate donating, because that's important. But we shouldn't only think about donating money, but we should also think about donating other resources that people could need. I mean, I saw medical supplies, syringes, even things as simple as diapers, stuff that, because everybody sends water and blankets, but other things that people would need. That's when it goes to donations. However, there are numerous church affiliations across many denominations that send contingencies, people that are willing to volunteer to go down to these areas. And you have to think out of the box. You have to think, do I speak another language, right? If you speak Spanish, you could donate your time, go for 2 weeks as a communicator, and that was a huge need in Puerto Rico, right? Go down if you're a medical professional, especially some of the ancillary professionals like nurses and stuff like that, could go down there and donate a week of their time. JetBlue, was flying people round trip medical personnel for between $50 and $100. And they did that for weeks. So you could, and you would be guaranteed a seat back and a seat going there. And so you could volunteer your time, and there were agencies, Red Cross, other church affiliations, and then other private organizations. There's a group called Heart 9/11. Heart 9/11 is founded by a New York City police officer. It has many New York City police officers and firefighters that go around the world. They go all over the world, wherever there's an earthquake or a natural disaster. They will fly you to the area, and you will help rebuild homes. So they pay for your flight and for other stuff, and you're just donating your time and your energy. Also, you could consider, how could you go to your local chapter and maybe adopt people. If they can't come to you, how could you kind of adopt a family into what it is that they need and communicate? So, for example, if you were a person devastated, whether it's Texas or Florida or Puerto Rico, and you might be able to donate hours of your time from the comfort of your office at home, filing paperwork, FEMA paperwork and other paperwork on your computer, utilizing your technology, the fact that you have power. That's the great thing about today. You could be sitting thousands of miles away, and you could be helping that person file their claims from where you're at. Those things could work, and you putting your skills to use. So it could be either through donations, rebuilding, volunteering manpower, and even volunteering computer skills and communication skills.
With the couple minutes that we have left here, Bill, I'll just transition to ask you, not so much about your work all over the place, but the work inside the house that you come home to, and your boys. It's kind of an exciting time for everybody in hemophilia, but there's some, additional excitement, I think, for people with hemophilia B with some of the new products that have come out and how far along some of the gene therapy work is. It's an exciting time. So what's going on in your family? How are your boys doing? And what are you thinking about with regard to all these treatment developments?
We're very optimistic. We've been optimistic from the get-go. We were very fortunate that at the time when my oldest son turned 16 this past week, they've always been on a recombinant product. So we've been lucky to not have to deal with safety issues. However, we were victims of safety issues with both my wife's father and his brother. We know that the advances have come through sacrifice, and we stand really on the shoulders of giants who have gotten hepatitis, HIV, massive bleeds, orthopedic surgeries, and so I think that hemophilia is so rapidly advancing. Very optimistic about gene therapy. I'm very grateful for the Genome Project and My Life Project. I think that it's going to tell us tremendous information moving forward. Long-acting factor products have increased the quality of life in my own family, which has allowed all of my sons to participate in sports. Extremely optimistic for the hemophilia A and B community with the therapies that are on the horizon and the ones we have today.
Well, Bill, great to hear from you. Thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule to share this information with me and with the community. I think you've shined a light on some of the things that you experience in these areas that people like me and most of our listeners would never be aware of, and some really concrete ideas on how you can go from feeling helpless to being helpless to being extraordinarily helpful when disaster strikes. So thank you for taking the time to make all of that abundantly clear.
The biggest thing that anybody could have is communication, and your voice is important to us. Thank you very much for what you do and for getting this message out and connecting us to each other all over the country. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Bill. See you soon.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
This BloodStream episode, like all of our BloodStream episodes, are brought to us by Shire. And for that we say, thank you, Shire.
We've reached that time once again for our parting shots. One last piece, one last bit of information, one last top-of-mind consideration, bleeding disorders related or otherwise, that we leave the audience with before we say goodbye. Natalie, as you scratch your back and stare at me with riveted anticipation, what is your parting shot for this month?
Well, my parting shot kind of related a little bit to Bill's interview and Bill's work with FEMA and disaster relief. Mm-hmm. But a couple weeks ago, you and I experienced an earthquake here in LA.
Oh, yeah, we did. Yes, we did.
And it didn't result in disaster, but it resulted in 30 seconds of, oh my gosh, what's happening? I mean, our bookshelves were shaking. And I just think, I know we've talked about this before on the podcast, but, it's always post disaster where you're like, oh, what could we have done better? And I just think it's really, really important to like think of those things and to prepare with your family, because being prepared is priceless. And I mean, you can't prepare for everything, right? But just like having a plan and having Factor like ready to rock and roll and supplies feels very important, because like if that was bigger than what it was, like we would have had our little bag and we could go. But I mean, when it first started happening, I was like, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do?
I know. And then it keeps going too. And it was like, oh, is this like a thing? Like, are we going to have to like do something? Because I don't know what you do now.
Yeah.
Where do we go?
Like, do we stay in the apartment?
People? Yeah. Like, I don't know. Beyond checking Twitter, I'm not really sure what to be doing right now.
Which, if it was greater magnitude,
yeah,
I don't know if checking Twitter would have helped us.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, so it just feels incredibly important. And yeah, I mean, it was a pretty small earthquake here, but enough to like shake us.
Yeah, literally.
So, yeah.
That's good.
And what's your parting shot?
Well, you know, because of Bombardier Blood, I've been talking with a lot of people, both in and out of the community, but in the community, about documentaries, and meeting a lot of people who tell me like, oh, I love documentaries. And so we just getting to chat a little bit about documentaries. And since I've been watching a lot of them recently, I wanted to share one that I've watched from a filmmaker who I'm now really into, and I've talked with Natalie about a bunch, made her watch one of his documentaries recently. His name is Matthew Heineman. He's the director, cinematographer, editor on Cartel Land, which was an incredible, I believe, Oscar-nominated documentary a couple years ago. But the one that I want to shout out right now is called City of Ghosts. It was made or released last year, and it follows the Syrian media activist group Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. And it's a really interesting story. Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. It was a group of it's a citizen journalist group, a group of citizens who saw that ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, they were descending upon Syria, and in particular Raqqa, when there was this power vacuum, and they were little by little asserting their power. And as these groups of citizens were noticing, like, this is wrong, like they're saying one thing, but something else is happening, they just started taking cell phone videos of what was going on and reporting very quietly, piece by piece. As things got worse and this group started to grow, they also started to become targets. So this film, the filmmaker follows the leaders of Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently as they actually make their way out of Raqqa so that they can run all the outward communications from a satellite location, as everyone in Raqqa who's a part of this feeds them the information and the updates. But just trying to find, I mean, they were destroying satellites in Raqqa to try to prevent the communication with the rest of the Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently group. And just watching the resilience of these individuals, and there's this extraordinary moment right at the end of the documentary, which I won't spoil, that just affected me on a few levels. And I think it's intended to affect people on a few levels as a storyteller. Yeah, I don't want to say anything much about it. It's a phenomenal documentary. If you enjoy documentaries, you will enjoy this. If you're interested in international conflict, you will appreciate this film. And the characters and these young people who are running this organization, and literally their lives are on the line every moment of every day. Their families are targeted. Some of their family members are assassinated in attempts to shut them down. It's just an incredible film, and it reminds me why we make films. So, it's called City of Ghosts. It's by Matthew Heineman. You can just Google it. You can find it online somewhere. I did. So I'm sure you can. And that's my parting shot for this month. And that is all for this episode. So special thanks to everybody at Believe Limited, the National Hemophilia Foundation, Entertainment to Effect Change, the Hemophilia Alliance, and of course our sponsor, Shire. Thanks as well to Share segment contributor Maryann May, interview guest Bill Patsakos, and comment segment guest Dr. Stephen Pipe. Check out BloodStreamMedia.com and subscribe to the BloodStream Podcast, the Ask the Expert Podcast, and the Powering Through Podcast. And you know what? How about also the Bloodline Podcast to hear all of BloodStream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorders community. You can email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You can find us on facebook.com/bloodstreammedia and on Twitter @bloodstreaminfo. Reminder to check the program notes for this episode in your podcast player or on bloodstreampod.com for links and additional information about the various stories featured on this episode. My name is Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm Natalie Lynch.
And until next time, take self-care
of yourself.
Yeah, there you go. Bye, everybody.